My name is Ivan Sutton Artist, born in Kilmore Quay, County Wexford. I first met Mr. Haughey in or around 1997 when Celtic Mist called into the Kilmore Quay harbour. I happened to be around with some friends, Bill Reardon and Des Walsh, and I think Bill Reardon knew Mr. Haughey and some of his, I think the skipper. Anyway, we helped him tie up, and as soon as that was done, Mr. Haughey invited us on board. When we went on board, Mr. Haughey asked the skipper to go for a walk, that he wanted to talk to these gentlemen, and he produced his best Chardonnay wine, and we started talking about various things. One of the things at the time was the millennium was coming up, and there was great controversy as to what was going to replace Nelson's Pillar in O'Connell Street. The main suggestion at the time was a spire that would be a beacon for people of Dublin to find the city centre. Mr. Haughey wasn't terribly enamoured with the spire. He thought something more relevant would be something to do with Dublin Bay, maybe an underground walking passage that tourists and people of Dublin could walk out into Dublin Bay and see the fish and see what was floating around out there. Anyway, I came up with the idea to Mr. Haughey that we should build a memorial to our politicians, and I said that we should put up a statue of our most famous politician, and he put out his hand and said, "A very good idea, Mr. Sutton." He says, I'll take that one on board," meaning himself, of course. The other thing which we discussed, I think, the Pope was coming to Ireland at the time, or maybe he had the Pope had just finished a visit, and there was a big, large cross built in the Phoenix Park for the papal mass. And when the Pope had gone back and everything had settled down, as Mr. Haughey said, a minor civil servant rang a politician to know what we're going to do about the cross. So I think he was a councillor. The councillor said, "Well, I can't possibly deal with that. This is a very emotive issue. Only the minister could decide on this." So then this minor civil servant, as Mr. Haughey said, rang the minister, and the minister said, "Oh no, I couldn't possibly deal with that. That would have to be Charlie Haughey himself." And anyway, Mr. Haughey said that this man rang him, and he said, "Mr. Haughey, what are we going to do about the cross in the Phoenix Park?" And Mr. Haughey said, "Grow trees around it, and as the trees grow up, the cross will appear to disappear." Anyway, whether that's a story or not, I think I was up around the park recently, and whether I saw trees or not, I actually don't know. On another occasion, Mr. Haughey came in Celtic Mist, and he arrived about 6 o'clock in the evening, and he was coming from Malahide Marina, where he had his base, and I happened to be down there, and I said to him, "What time did you leave?" "Oh," he said, "I left at very respectable 9 o'clock or something." I said, "You got here terribly quickly. I mean, that's a long way." He said, "Yeah." He said, "A new engine." And I said, "Oh yes," he said, "the new engine, we did about 12 or 13 knots." He said, "The old engine blew up," he said, "and it had a great insurance policy." Now, you'll have to read between the lines as to who the great benefactor was. On another occasion, I was on board, and Terry Keane had just announced that that she became public on her liaison with Mr. Haughey, and I think that was on a Friday night on the Late Late Show, and he was in here on a Saturday, and he said as we came on board, and I can't remember who was with us that time, Mr. Haughey said, now before we start anything, he said, there will be no talk about what happened on the television last night. And so we didn't. We got sometime we got near it, and Mr. Haughey said we won't go there. Now regarding myself, Mr. Haughey commissioned me to paint Celtic Mist, and well, before he did that, he bought a picture. He was in the Silver Fox. We used to dine in the Silver Fox when he was here, and on a Saturday evening, he was just retired as Taoiseach, so he had a Garda escort on board with him, and there was always guards hanging around the marina when he was here as well. However, he sent up this guard up to the Silver Fox to book dinner at 8 o'clock for 6 people. And the manageress at the time was Rena Cullen, and Rena Cullen said, we're fully booked up, we can't take any more bookings. And this man said, well, it's for Mr. Haughey. And Rena said, I don't care who it's for, we're booked up. And the man said, well, I can't go back to Mr. Haughey and tell him that we can't get in. He said, I want to talk to the manager. And the manager, and Marina said, the manager's not here. So anyway, they got in touch with Nicky Cullen, and Nicky borrowed a few tables, a table and some chairs from his mother, and they duly got in. On that particular night, actually, I wasn't there myself, but it is rumoured that Nicky Cullen sang one of his favourite songs, an Elvis song, I just can't remember the name of it now, and to loud cheers from Mr. Haughey and his gang and all the other diners. On that particular, the following morning, I got a message that night from Nicky Cullen to say that Mr. Haughey wanted to see me in the Silver Fox the following morning to discuss art. But Nicky forgot to tell his lady in the kitchen of this appointment. So when I arrived at 10 o'clock in the morning, the lady said, you can't come in, we're closed. And I said, well, we have permission from the owner, Nicky Cullen, to come. And she said, okay, so we came in anyway and looked around, and he decided on a picture, and going out, we went out through the kitchen, and I remember well Mr. Haughey shaking hands with the lady concerned, and he slipped a £20 note into her hand. That's the sort of man Mr. Haughey was. Anyway, sometime after that, he rang me and said, Celtic Mist. He didn't say who he was. I remember the gravelly voice I recognised immediately. Rang on one of my old-fashioned mobile phones and said, Celtic Mist is coming into the harbour today, and I want you to paint a picture. I said, well, how would you like it painted? In backdrop or anything else, or size? He said, I'll leave it to yourself totally. I won't never tell an artist what to do. And anyway, my late mother, was listening to this, because it was, when I took the call, it was in her house in Kira, here in Kilmore Quay. And anyway, we discussed the size and when the picture would be delivered, and I said, okay, Mr. Haughey, we'll be in touch. And when I put the phone down, my mother said, that's great, but she said, you've made a terrible mistake. I said, what's that? You never told him the price. I said, oh God, no, that's pretty dim. And I went to the pub that night, and I was telling my friends, And they were saying, you'll never get paid, never get paid. Anyway. So a month later I had the picture completed. Now, what I did was I painted the Celtic mist on the marina with the church and the village in the background, including our own house and studio. And I made, the trawlers were in it, but I made Celtic mist slightly bigger and the trawlers slightly smaller. And I think Charlie loved this. And anyway, when I rang him to say the picture was ready, he said, "Come out today." And I said, "No, Mr. Haughey, I can't come out today. I'll come out tomorrow." He said, "Oh, I'd much prefer to see it now today." And I couldn't tell him, in fact, that I had tennis on a Monday evening, and I just couldn't cancel it, because if you cancel tennis, I'm cancelling 3 other people. So anyway, we went out the following morning, arrived at 12 o'clock, and as we drove up, he must have been looking out, because he opened the door immediately, and he was thrilled with the picture, and he brought us into the bar, and we had a glass of his finest Chardonnay wine. And after about an hour he said, "How much is the picture?" And I told him the price, which I can't remember now, and he said, "Very reasonable." And off he goes, and he comes back with a cheque signed by drawn up by himself, but signed by him. Drawn up by his secretary, who happened to be there at the time, Moore, I think was her name, and drawn on the Ulster Bank in Malahide, which I duly, of course, cashed and was paid for. At the time, I was amused that he, even though it was maybe spring, April or May, he was in more or less his bare feet, his slippers on, so he had something the matter with his feet at the time. So anyway, as I sit here recording this message in this chair, at the time we went down to the Silver Fox, he asked to see my studio, and he came up here, and Mr. Haughey sat in this chair and looked out and looked at the harbour and looked at the salty islands. And he said, "I'd like this." He wasn't talking about the chair now. I said, "Mr. Haughey, don't even think about it. You don't even think about it." Mary and I made several visits to Kinseely, to Mr. Haughey's residence. And on one occasion, way back, in fact, in 2004, I was 60 years of age, and I published a book called Sutton at 60. And I wrote to all the art people in Dublin, the auctioneers that I was dealing with, and including Mr. Haughey, to know would they write one sentence in my book. Now, so everybody agreed to do it. I won't list them here, but all the major art dealers in Ireland agreed to do it. Just one sentence. And I was nearly finished the whole thing when, in fact, the phone rang, and again this gravelly voice said, "Am I too late for the book?" And I said, "No, Mr. Haughey, you're not too late." Well, he said, "Come out tomorrow." He said, I'll give you a few words." So we arrived out anyway, and he had produced the which is in the book Sutton at 60, these sentence, paragraph. And whilst we were there, and we were in the dining room at that stage, and Mrs. Haughey came in, and Charlie introduced her, and she said, "Excuse me now, I just want to tell Charlie that I've done all the Christmas shopping for the grandchildren." And he said, "Oh, wonderful, that great, we got it all over in the one day, etc., etc." But she was a very nice lady. Generally speaking, I have to say, on a personal note, I think that Charlie Haughey was one of Ireland's great politicians. He was a very positive influence on Northern Ireland. He was probably the most dominant politician of our time. He had his faults and weaknesses, but in 500 years' time, when Irish history is written, he'll be up there with the great names like Daniel O'Connell and Michael Collins, and it will include Charlie Haughey. One final thing that happened, that he way back, his boat, before he got Celtic Mist, he had an old trawler, and the trawler hit the mizzen, and she sank. Now, Mr. Haughey told Mary and I that it wasn't a fear of the whole event. It was there was so much oil and diesel floating around the water that it nearly went into his lungs and nearly killed him. However, I heard later from another source that the lifeboat crew went out on that night, and effectively the lifeboat crew saved Mr. Haughey and his crew and brought them back to Baltimore. Now, Mr. Haughey said he was in such a state that night that he'd like to thank them all properly the following morning, and could he meet them at 11 o'clock, which he duly did. And so there were 6 crew involved, the coxswain and a crew of 5, including an 18-year-old who had never been out in the lifeboat before. He was a raw recruit, and anyway, they all lined up, and Mr. Haughey said, "Listen, I want to thank you all very much for saving my life and everybody else's lives too, and if there's anything I can do for you, just let me know now." So the coxswain said, "Well, listen, Mr. Haughey, I have a little bit of a planning issue. You might be able to help me." And Charlie said, "No problem." The next crew member said he had some land, and I think he said he wanted Quilcha to buy it and grow a forest, and so on and down forth, so forth. And when he got to the 18-year-old, who was nervous as bedamned, he said, "And you, young man, what could I do for you?" He said, "Mr. Haughey, you want to give me a state funeral?" "A state funeral?" said Mr. Haughey. "Why?" he said. "Well," he said, "when I go home and tell my parents that I shook your hand," he said, "they'll kill me." Anyway, those are my recollections of Charles J. Haughey in the summer of 2016.